Hello, and welcome to the Frontline to Finish Line podcast, your go-to sport and exercise medicine podcast series. I'm Claire Spear, a specialist MSK physiotherapist and Pilates instructor with an interest in aquatic physiotherapy. And I'll be joined by my co-host, Dr. Ralph Mitchell, a GP with a specialist interest in sport and exercise medicine, who has vast experience across both elite sport and the NHS. Together, across this series, we'll be speaking to a number of industry-leading experts, exploring some fascinating topics across the multidisciplinary world of sport and exercise medicine. We're delighted to have you join us, and we hope you enjoy the listen. So this evening, we'd like to welcome Professor Margo Mountjoy to the Frontline to Finish Line podcast. We are delighted to welcome our first international speaker. We're going international, all the way across the Atlantic in Canada. And Professor Mountjoy is a renowned researcher. She's a clinician. She has, I'm going to let her give a little resume of what she's done, because the list is endless, but she has a huge wealth of experience at working with elite athletes. Today, we've invited her on the podcast to speak about RED-S, a condition that is affecting more and more athletes, and we're really interested to hear about her work with elite athletes as well as research that she has done into the condition. So welcome, Margo. Thank you for joining us this evening.
A pleasure to be here, and thanks so much for the invitation to chat with you and your listeners about RED-S. Very excited for the opportunity.
Would you like to tell us a little bit about your background and what's led you to having the interest in RED-S?
Sure, happy to. So I'm a clinician scientist, as you mentioned, so clinician in sports medicine for over 30 years, working with community athletes and elite athletes. In particular, elite athletes in the endurance sports, long distance runners, triathlon, ultra marathoners, and then aesthetic sports as well. So a wide variety of athletes. As a researcher, really my research and my PhD was driven from what I was seeing clinically. So I'm a clinician first and a researcher second. And any of the research I do is clinically oriented to try and improve athlete health and change clinician behavior to improve athlete health. So the areas I work in are RED-S because I saw so much of it. For many years, I was telling my male athletes they had the female athlete triad, which of course they did, but the terminology wasn't convenient for them. And I also work in areas of mental health, which I see as a spin-off often in RED-S. And another part of my area of interest is female athlete health and safeguarding in sport. So a little bit of an eclectic background based on my experiences as a clinician team doc.
Amazing, thank you. So I suppose the obvious thing to start with for anybody listening is what is RED-S? Can you tell us? It's very complex, but in a nutshell, can you give us?
Sure, happy to explain what RED-S is. It's a clinically diagnosed multifactorial syndrome. It's a health condition, and it's characterized by an accumulation of health and performance deleterious effects that's a result of that athlete's exposure to problematic low energy availability. So to define it according to the literature, it's a syndrome of impaired physiological and psychological function caused by exposure to problematic, which means prolonged or severe low energy availability, causing detriments to many body systems, which either individually or synergistically lead to impaired health, increased injury risk, and decreased sports performance.
And tell us what RED stands for, if you don't mind. So
Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport. Yes, that's a very good thing we should have done. Relative energy deficiency in sport.
And it's interesting that you used it in sport, because I'd heard of it as relative energy deficiency syndrome. So what's the change in terminology around there?
It always was in sport. It was never syndrome. It was always in sport. I've since published a paper with some colleagues in dance called RED-D, Relative Energy Deficiency in Dance. Similar concepts physiologically. Different language in terms of different social contexts and sport culture or performance culture, and also co-authored a paper on RED-M, Relative Energy Deficiency in military personnel.
Okay.
We're also high-performing individuals who don't see themselves as athletes, much like dancers don't see themselves as athletes. But all three of those populations, athletes, military, and dance, have high energy expenditures, and they must perform for a certain objective, be it art, be it defense, be it sport performance. So the body itself doesn't know whether it's reacting to dance versus sport versus military. So it's a similar syndrome, just a different social context. So therefore, different language is used.
You talked about, sorry, go on, Ralph.
I was just saying it's really interesting to hear it's been divided up like that. But from a clinical perspective, there isn't really any difference. Has there been any sort of, you see, differences in male and female, or in the military or older, younger populations who've been prone to suffer from REDS?
So we certainly see differences in genders because women aren't little men, and we see different presentations, different timelines. We know there are also different levels at which males versus females or men versus women tolerate energy deficits. But in terms of your question of whether it's military is different than, say, dance or different from sport, it depends on the demands on that individual's body. Certainly in the military, it's a lot of weight-bearing, long-distance endurance. So there's the endurance component to it, whereas in dance, there is a culture of aesthetic and needing to be a certain body type. And so there's more restrictive eating in dance, in addition to the performance demands of energy. So we see a different, perhaps, cause or underpinning factor for it, as opposed to really not a lot different in terms of clinical presentations.
And I suppose then that sort of leads on then really is how prevalent is this? I mean, a lot of us have experienced working in team sports or sports here in the UK. Obviously, in other countries, endurance sports is more popular. Is there different prevalences in different groups of athletic populations?
Yeah, so that's a very, very good question. We know that certain sports are higher prevalence than others. So we don't see it a lot in archery or the precision sports. We see it in the endurance sports. So if we look at track and field, I'm not likely to see it as much in a shot putter or a triple jumper as I am in the decathlete or the long distance runner. There's been a recent, so literally August 2024, pan-Canadian study in the BGSM on REDS. And this was a very interesting study because it had 143 women and 70 men, all tier 3 to 5, so high level, national, international level athletes from a variety of sports, athletics, track, rowing, cycling, swimming, triathlon, speed skating, rugby, judo, boxing, volleyball, field hockey, soccer, and softball. So a real mix of team sport and individual sport. And the prevalence, as your question, how prevalent is the prevalence in this study for REDS was 55%.
Wow.
36% were green, which means they do not have REDS. 55%, 55%, let me get my numbers straight. 55% were green. That means they did not have. So 45% had REDS, 36% were yellow, 5% orange, and 4% REDS. So certainly less as you get to the more serious level of REDS. But that's just to give you an idea in that multi-sport, fairly large multi-sport cohort of the prevalence. So if the clinicians are listening to this and they look after any of those athletes, there's a potential that could be something that there should be seen or might be seeing in their practice.
That's really interesting. Higher than I thought it was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
55 was very high, but 45 is still, that's almost half.
Yeah, it's almost half. And these are well taken care of, well-resourced athletes from a country that has an awareness of REDS. So I think there's work to be done, and that's what we're doing today.
Do you think there's a difference between those kind of higher level athletes and the amateurs, maybe the weekend warriors, because I think we're seeing a real uplift in the amateurs doing much higher intensity level sport, like the Ironmans, like the ultramarathons. Do you think there's
it's a very relevant question, and it's one that I don't have exact numbers to, except to say in my clinical practice I saw a lot of amateurs with REDS because they see what the elites are doing and they think, I want to be like them, and I will do their volumes. I will do that without the infrastructure that the elites had in terms of nutritional support, medical screening, all of the things. So in fact, our elites, actually, the numbers I gave you, which are tier 3 to 5, which are elites, may actually be low compared to amateurs, because sometimes the amateurs try to emulate without the knowledge and the supports. So I actually saw a fair bit in amateur athletes that were just gung-ho, people that were going to go ahead and do these high volumes without the infrastructure to support them. Prevention work, monitoring their loads, nutrition support, mental health support, all these things that we know are important to prevent illness and injury in the elite athlete population.
And going back to your clinical caseload, what would be, for any clinicians listening, what would be kind of the real kind of triggers or flags to you that would make you start to think, do I need to be considering RED-S in this person?
Well, that's a very good question. What should I be looking for clinically if I'm worried? Because it is a bit of a silent syndrome, right? It's not something, no one books an appointment to say, I'd like to come today because I have RED-S, right? Nobody does that. What do they most often present with? And I would see a variety of things. Often I looked after a lot of weight-bearing sports, so they'd come in with stress fractures. Well, frankly, that's too late when they come to me with a stress fracture. But certainly if you're seeing stress fractures, there are many causes of stress fractures. RED-S is certainly one that underpins a lot of them. So if you're seeing stress fractures, I want you to be thinking not about just 6 weeks off and then return to sport, but why are they having a stress fracture? What is it that's causing it? So stress fractures is something you may see that should tweak you to be looking for signs of RED-S. The other thing is whether or not your athlete is amenorrheic. And women are a little bit more educated now to know that that's probably not okay. I mean, hopefully gone are the days when, the training goal was you're not training hard enough because you still have your period. And that used to be a coaching goal that, you've got to train harder because you still have your period, you're not training hard enough. So that is not okay. And hopefully that's gone. And women are a little bit more educated now as our coaches that really regular menstrual cycle means the body's happy and functioning well, and a happy functioning body will be a better performing body as well. I also, patients would come to me because their sport performance is falling off. They're putting all of this effort into it. They were doing all of these things. They're getting slower, or they weren't getting the gains they were expecting in performance. And they were, tired, listless, didn't have the energy, weren't enjoying it as much, weren't getting out of it, that kind of thing. And either the coach was saying them in because fix them, they're not performing, or the athletes themselves were saying, I just don't feel like I'm getting anywhere. And, many reasons for it. There's always a differential diagnosis. It's not all RED-S, and I think that's really important for people to know. It's a diagnosis of exclusion. You must exclude your differential diagnosis for the things you're seeing, and then look at the gestalt or the bigger picture of that person, their physiology, their energy, low energy availability, exposure, and then put the pieces together using our clinical tool.
That's interesting to think that, it's multifactorial. You sort of piece it all together. And I think, and rightly so, the female side of the equation has been highlighted now. And I think any of us in looking after athletes and reporting amenorrhea, we'd certainly want to pick up on that. But I'm interested to know, from a male perspective, what are the signs? Are they different, obviously, to females? And if so, what are they? And is it harder to pick up?
It's a little bit harder to pick up in men athletes than it is in women athletes. And I think that's because women have a regular menstrual cycle, or they should, and men don't have that sort of visible marker, that's an obvious sign of either a problem or not. So what I would often see in my men athletes, but only because I was asking, is a low libido and low number and quality of morning erections. So that is the equivalent of the sex hormones in the men versus the sex hormones in the women having menstrual dysfunction and the men having sexual dysfunction in that regard. But that's not usually presenting symptom. Rarely the young man would come to me and said, my sex drive is low in my sport clinic. But hopefully in future, we'll be teaching our men to think about these things. And that will be one of the things they'll be looking at as one of their parameters of, I hope I'm okay. So in men, what I would often see was more some of the physical detriments related to RED-S, which would be the GI upset, or bone injuries, repetitive infections that seem more than everybody else, and lack of performance. Sometimes it was mental health issues, behavioral issues, mental health issues that were the presenting sign and symptom for them.
It's really interesting. I see. I mean, it's good to know that there is recognition, and there is difference, or there obviously would be big differences between them. But if you were a coach, or anybody else who's not maybe part of the medical team, what kind of things would you then be looking for? If you say performance related, would there be other things you were looking out for as well?
I think so. I think a good coach knows their athletes well and their personality well, and hopefully a coach would be looking carefully for someone who has body image issues. They're concerned maybe drive for thinness, maybe someone who's an obsessive exercise that goes off and does more exercise than what the coach is giving them. Those kinds of risk factors for REDS in terms of body image, eating disorders, disordered eating, and then also personality changes. Some of the early signs we see of in the mental health sphere as well. So, but often the coaches would bring them to me for lack of performance issues.
That's great.
Thinking about the kind of the lay person that might be listening to this, I think just for a little bit of clarity around the length of time, because I think it's very easy for kind of drop into a little bit of an energy deficit. I think we've all been there where we use a cycling term, we've bonked. You kind of run out of energy midway through and you just have nothing left to give, as opposed to REDS developing. And how would you kind of categorize? Is there a difference in time? How long would you expect that kind of deficiency to go on for before it starts to become a problem? Is there a defined?
Right. No, that's a very good question, because we wake up every morning in energy deficiency and we haven't eaten for, 14 hours or so. And that's not a problem. That's not a health problem. That we have breakfast and we carry on. Yeah. So low energy availability itself is not an issue. In fact, if we look at the health of society and all of the obesity and metabolic syndrome and all of the health repercussions in westernized society, we could use a little low energy availability, adaptable low energy availability, where people could healthily lose some of the risk factors of weight and then exercise more for health benefits. So that's adaptable low energy availability. But when does it become problematic? I think is your question. How long does it take for it to become problematic? And that's a really good question. And I wish I had a cut line that I could say, oh, well, if it's before this cut line, it's fine, and after it's not, because it's not. And the reason it's not that cut and dried is because we're all individuals in terms of our own physiology. We know there's a difference between individuals, but there's also a difference between ages. 14-year-old woman menstrual cycle is much more vulnerable to low energy availability than a 35-year-old woman. So a well-established menstrual cycle is less vulnerable than a young menstrual cycle. And so there's in an individual, there's variability in their tolerance, even within themselves over time as well. So it doesn't happen overnight, and it's usually within months. And so if, say, for an example, people would have the summer off, they'd come back, say, to a collegiate system or university sports system, and they all of a sudden are in a heavy training block. And if they keep that up without fueling it properly, I would sometimes see issues by November, December. So it's a couple of months, that kind of thing. But it depends on the duration, depends on the severity, and it depends on their physiological function and factors into variability, and it depends on their history. So lots of variables that go into it. And that's what we as clinicians, that's our job, to look at that individual and sort out all of those things. Rule out some differential. By far, the most common cause of amenorrhea in my practice was pregnancy, not REDS.
Yeah.
I mean, if we look at the age of our population, it's pregnancy. Yeah. It's not REDS. Yeah. So don't forget to be a clinician first and look at all of the different factors.
That's a really important message, isn't it? I think when there's so much information out there about a certain condition, it's like everything is until it fits. And you're saying absolutely, it's around looking at your differential, ruling out before you go to there. Have it in the back of your mind, but ruling out first.
Yeah, but make sure it's in your mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm interested to think when we talk about the actual relative energy deficit, is that usually an intake problem or an expenditure problem or both?
Oh, Ralph, you ask the best questions. Yeah, in some individuals, it's an intake issue. And those are the individuals, the classic history of body image issues, exercise dependence, drive for thinness, perfectionist in a sport where thinness and leanness is encouraged. Aesthetic sports, artistic swimming, gymnastics, dance, equestrian, because they are judged and they don't want to jiggle on the horse. So a lot of equestrian athletes. So those are the energy intake challenges. And if you, a non-athlete can have energy intake challenges and run into lots of body deficits. We know that from the eating disorder population. So you can have an eating disorder in sport and run into all kinds of issues with REDS. On the other side, and more of my athletes ran into REDS from the overexpenditure of energy. And those were the ultramarathoners, the long distance runners, the young yahoos who didn't know that they shouldn't be doing what the older, more established athletes were doing. And they were spending so much energy that they didn't either know how to keep up with the energy demands, because appetite at that high level of energy expenditure is not accurate. It's a not accurate measure of how much you need to eat. And I think that's where people would fall, oh, I'm eating well. I'm really hungry and I eat all the time. I don't have energy deficit. But when you looked at it, they did, because they were eating salad over and over and over again. So they were filling up, feeling full, but they weren't actually nutrient or energy dense foods that they were taking in. And by far, those were the majority of what I saw, weren't the eating disorders. It was the overexpenditure of energy. And then, of course, there's a mix in between, right? There's a mix in the middle. And some people don't take in enough because they have food insecurity. I mean, we can't forget that there's certain percentages of our population of athletes in particular who have financial barriers and restrictions and maybe can't afford either the volumes or the quality of food they need to have that. So don't forget about, the food insecurity folks that may have challenges getting the proper foods to fuel their sport as well.
Do you have any group of those that can't maybe afford the fuel? Are there any particular tips that you give to people about lower cost, good quality nutrition that helps them?
Yeah, sure. I mean, part of it is it's not just lower cost, it's knowledge of what foods have energy dense nutrients as well as micro and macronutrients in it. Peanut butter is a good one. It's not very expensive, goes a long way. We all want people to have nuts and avocados and cheeses and things like that, but it's not always feasible. But certainly, there's low cost solutions. But so much part of food and changing behaviors is culture and personal preferences. And that's where I work really closely with my team. And my team isn't functional without a very good sports dietitian who can get to know that individual athlete, know what they like to eat, and it can train them around. Keep eating what you like to eat. Can we add this to it? Can we add this to it? Can we change when you're eating? Because some people would go, yeah, I'm eating X number of calories and I'm expending X number of calories, but they're going all day without food and eating all their calories at nighttime. Well, for the majority of the day, they're in energy deficient state. They have low energy availability. So timing the food may just be the trick.
Yeah.
And then timing the food with what they like and then adding that energy on top of it.
Is it depending on the macronutrient as well and what they're doing? I suppose if you're a rugby player could end up in this position and somebody's not consume enough, say, protein, or is it it's simply carbohydrate, or is there differences between macronutrient groups?
Yes, low carbohydrate has been absolutely identified as independently showing signs of REDS, independent of energy. So the low carbohydrate can synergistically or independently cause REDS. So the carbohydrate is really key. It's not usually protein because that's not a great not an energy source, not the best one out there. It's low carbohydrate availability, and there's been some good studies around low carbohydrate availability causing REDS, summarized in our last consensus.
Interesting. The other thing that I was thinking was for those athletes that may be listening to this and have slight concerns, the first message would be go and speak to GP or doctor. But if they haven't got access to that amazing team around them, what would be kind of the resources that you point them towards? Or are there certain things, the simple things that they can do just to try and monitor where they're at with their energy deficiency?
No, that's also an excellent question. I think being educated themselves and listening to this podcast and maybe reading some of the papers that are published on REDS would be very helpful. Hopefully, most physicians are now being trained and catching some education around REDS. Certainly in my medical school that I work in, all of our students have a paper-based case, and it's a REDS case because it's an excellent way to learn physiology, because it's a complex body, and REDS is a complex physiological phenomenon. So REDS is an excellent case. So hoping that your GP or family doctor will be able to assist and guide you. And if not, if you have access to sports medicine clinic or sports dietitian, would be awesome.
That's good to know. It's like you say, if it's more prevalent in the non-professional, should we say, athletes who don't have the access to elite sports medicine cover, then it's really important that the family physician, who's their often first point of contact, is skilled in this. Do you find that there is good understanding now amongst the non-SEM community for this condition, or is it sort of picked up in endocrinology clinics or gynecology clinics, that type of thing?
Yeah, that's quite variable. There's not a lot of literature written on this. There is one nice study looking at recognition of the female athlete triad, which of course is the precursor to REDS, and it showed variable understanding and knowledge. So I think there's work to be done, and I thank all of you on this podcast for shining the light on this and being part of the solution to that problem of making sure that people understand and we disseminate the knowledge, and that people know when they're running into trouble and where to go to for help.
I mean, it's such an important thing, and I think the longer you work in sport, the often easier it is to see it and recognize. It's not always easy to pick it up, but over time, that sort of experience just tells you this athlete's just displaying behaviors that is a bit concerning or isn't attributable to something in the past, like you say, poor sports performance, mental health issues. If there's something underlying all those issues, i.e. this energy deficit, then it's even more so. I think for me as well, hearing what you're saying about non-professional athletes, this day and age with a camera phone, everybody's given insights into what it's like to be a professional athlete, and everybody trains now like a professional athlete. Amateur races, Ironmans, running a marathons, that the standard just seems to be going up every year in amateur sport, and therefore makes me think that this condition is just going to be more and more prevalent, especially amongst the younger generation who've got access to.
Absolutely. They were almost the more challenging ones for me to see. So I worked quite a few decades in a university setting. It was the incoming first year young women that came in from high school that had been very successful athletes in high school and were broken and had severe REDS because they'd been training such high volumes with not good nutrition, as teenage girls are known not to have good nutrition, with fad diets and trying to be skinny and do what their friends do who have no energy expenditures in school, right? And so it took me a couple of years to get some of these women on track in terms of, I don't mean on the track literally, but on track nutritionally and health-wise, to get them to a point where they could actually fuel the level of sport they were wanting to, which meant there was a little performance deficit because they would burn out, and then we had to build them back up again. And that's hard. That's the hard part, I think, is because people learn that if you lose a little bit of weight in some sports that are weight dependent or body muscle to power ratio, that they can actually perform faster. And we know that. That's why we often manipulate body composition in a very elite athlete in those sports only safely to that ideal competition body composition for ideal competition, and then bring them back up for training. That is only in the very elite, very well controlled individual with a whole team of people supporting them. But I'd see the youth trying to emulate the body image of the marathon runner who won the Olympic gold medal and train like that. Well, that doesn't work. In fact, if you saw that marathon runner off season or during training, she didn't look like that either.
Yeah.
So, that's where they run into trouble. They think, oh, well, when I lost weight before, I got faster and I'm slowing down. So I'm going to try and lose more weight so I can go faster because it worked last time. But guess what? The more weight she lost or he lost, the worse they did because they just kept going into further and further energy deficit. So to train that mindset of I need to be lighter to go faster, I'm saying, well, let's change your diet and you might gain a few pounds to make you go faster. That was really hard for them to grasp.
It seems to be very popular in cycling now. That's sort of been a big shift in performance, moving away just from REDS on its own, but from actual performance based now, that athletes are recognizing the power of carbohydrate and fueling
Yeah.
It's purposely and being heavier, but actually performing faster than they were lighter. And I think that's great to see. And
Yeah.
you did a good job of publicizing that now that you can
Yeah.
go through when fueled.
Funny how that works, isn't it? Put enough gas in the tank, the engine will go better. So yeah, cycling was in serious, I think, health risks. And most of our information, at least early information on REDS in men, came from cyclists and jockeys,
Wow.
because there was a performance advantage of being smaller, they thought, because of the, and also lightweight rowing in men, we saw as well.
It just brought to mind kind of some of the athletes I see, certainly dancers and young athletes, that are very talented. And because of that, they're going to schools where sport is a big part of the curriculum. And I think there's probably a piece here around educating teachers and parents as well, because I see so many that are doing 2-3 hours of sport a day in school, then doing another hour out of school, then doing 7-8 hours on a weekend, no rest days. And, it's like, how do they balance that? Because they love it. It's really hard to say to somebody who's enjoying that sport to pull back. So what advice do you give to those kind of athletes that you see?
Yeah, I think that's really key that you mentioned this education, not just of the athletes but also of the parents, because sometimes parents are the ones pushing them, or they're the ones putting food on the plate, and they may think, well, all of my teenage kids eat this, so that's what you get for dinner. Well, in fact, this teenage child perhaps has way more energy expenditures than the other ones and needs to actually eat more. So parents, coaches, or even if they're at a specialized sports school where they live in, does that sports school have the nutritional knowledge on how to best fuel these kids? Because these athletes are not only performing at a high level and high energy expenditures, they're growing. And growing takes energy. So we want to make sure they have enough energy to grow. But not only that, what's really important, to me as a clinician, is that during those years of adolescence is when they lay all of their bone matrices and bone density. And if they don't get it then, it's really hard to catch up later. In fact, you probably won't catch up later. You will catch up some, but you're not going to catch up as if you were doing it. And that's the problem, is those teenage years, we often don't know and don't see, because how do you see your bone density? And whoever measures it in a teenager, right? Yeah. Because you don't. So in fact, the girls who are on the diet because, milk causes fat, well, first of all, it doesn't. But, I can't eat milk because I'll get fat. And then, of course, that's a good calcium source. And I can't eat yogurt. And, all these I can't eat. Those are the ones I worry about. I'm not sure I answered your question, though. What do I say to them? It was your question.
It was around advice for kind of the teachers, parents with
yeah.
those.
So I think making sure they're part of the target education groups for REDS education is really key. And if there's parents or coaches listening, thank you, because you need to hear this message to this podcast today. And certainly in the work I'm doing with the IOC, I have different target populations for REDS translation. And the one that we're embarking on in 2025 is trying to reach coaches. It's not an easy group to reach. Athletes and coaches are the two. We're doing a reasonable job at reaching clinicians. I think we could do a better job, but we have embedded REDS education in the IOC diploma course, the advanced team physician course, and the Monaco conference. And I see it often on conference schedules, and of course it's in the literature. So we're reaching, and I just had a paper published today in the BJSM on the role of the physiotherapist in REDS as well. So trying to reach the clinicians, we're doing an okay job. We're trying to reach coaches and parents this next.
That sounds fascinating. I will be looking at that paper as a physiotherapist, look at the BJSM. Just going back to some of the things you were talking about, that long-term effect, I suppose for the younger athlete, that seems a little bit more obvious in terms of the bone density, but I guess there's more to it than bone density. So for the younger athletes, what are the longer-term potential effects? And also for the older athletes, the longer-term potential effects?
Yeah, they're both the same, whether they're younger or older. Yeah. It's a question of whether or not they comprehend or care. And one hopes that the more mature individual will be thinking about their long-term health and can understand that. I find that the younger athletes, if I say, well, if you don't look after this now, you might get a, low bone mineral density, and they automatically think of their grandma who had a fracture, and they think, oh, I'll worry about that then. That's not me. My way of engaging the younger athlete, and actually almost all the athletes, is I don't talk to them about, getting their periods back and protecting their bones from fragility fractures or stress fractures. I talk to them about, you want me to help you perform better?
Yeah.
Let me talk to you about performing better. I can help you actually get better in your sport, and we're going to do it by tweaking a couple of things and seeing your blood work. Here's some of the parameters that are not looking so great. We can tweak those, but we're going to tweak it with your diet, and it's going to take us some time, and we might have to change how you're spent, some of your training, but we can help you feel better and train better and get better sport performance outcomes. Because it's all true what I've said, but I didn't say I'm going to get your period back and I'm going to present you getting it, because they don't care. But they care about the things I mentioned about, which are all true.
Yeah. And in terms of blood, are there any particular blood markers that you look out for when you put in your blood work?
Yes, absolutely. In women, estrogen, and men, testosterone, because the sex hormones are the first affected. So if we look at, when are things affected, sex hormones are the first ones affected. So looking at the testosterone, free testosterone, and in the women, looking at estradiol and looking at LH-FSH, of course, ruling out other causes of those dysfunctions, but looking at those. The other one to look at is LDL, low density lipoprotein, because we see elevation in LDL. And also look at T3 because T3 is often suppressed. So those are, the ones that I also look at iron, because ferritin can be affected. But remember, there's other causes of low ferritin in athletes. But certainly the ferritin was a huge big part of my practice, trying to manage people's ferritins, especially in the long distance endurance athletes that really need those iron stores. So those are the main ones. There are others in the literature. They're not always available or affordable. So, it would be lovely to do growth factors, and it would be lovely to do some of the other bone markers and whatnot, but they're not always affordable and not always available around the world. So the things that we mentioned in the REDS Cap 2, the clinical assessment tool, are the ones I've mentioned, and they're the ones that are my go-tos.
Brilliant. Where can people find the clinical assessment tool?
So it's free on Google. So if you just Google IOC REDS CAT for clinical assessment tool, it'll come up.
And what we'll try and do is put that as a resource with the podcast. So we'll ask our team to add that into the podcast. So wherever you get your podcast from, you should be able to see the link for that, and that'll be really helpful. And anything else that we deem might be useful from this conversation to add in there.
Yeah.
Are there any other key messages that you think we haven't covered? Do you feel we've...
I'm quite keen to hear about anything about treatment, actually. I mean, what do you actually do when you get these patients?
Sure. Happy to chat about treatment. And I'm going to say that a big part of what I did was to actually try to prevent as well as treatment. So maybe I'll cover both of those things. If you're working with, say, a team or a group and you're seeing a fair bit of it, in fact, as a clinician, one of our roles is actually teaching and advocacy and trying to change behavior. So working with the coach to say, gee, you've got 4 people on your team with stress fractures. Maybe we could work together to try and change this story for next year. So working on the prevention part, and you got to have a coach on board, because I can tell you, anything a coach tells an athlete trumps anything I'm going to tell an athlete. So that's a very important individual to have on board. And then working with them either as a group. I remember taking a group of teenage, sort of 18, 19, 20-year-old young men and bringing them into the kitchen and teaching them how to cook, because they just had left home. They were living on their own and they didn't know how to cook. So, that whole, making sure that they, on the prevention side, that there's the knowledge, the coach buy-in, parent buy-in, and that they've got the, the ability to get some help. So on the treatment side, which is a very good question, what do you do? We've gone through the clinical assessment tool. We've diagnosed that I've got either a yellow or an orange, or I hope not, a red athlete. I hope they're all green, but we know that's not true. So then what do you do with them? And really, if you look at the literature in terms of treatment, first of all, rule out other causes, as I mentioned before, but in terms of treatment, now that you know it's REDS, it's really reversing the cause. So the cause is actually low energy availability. So reverse that. And it's usually, I work nutrition first, non-pharmacological interventions. So I would be looking at decreasing energy output, maybe, but really before that, it's increasing your energy input. Because, nobody wants to be told stop training. I don't do that. Very rare do I do that. I think the only time over 30 years I've done that is if someone is in severe red. They probably also had a severe eating disorder. They were hemodynamically unstable with a cardiac arrhythmia and electrolyte disturbances. I stopped that person from competing and training and went straight to the hospital. So those are the kinds of people I stopped from training. You may, in the orange and for sure in the red, need to decrease their energy output. But in the yellow and orange, most of the time, it's increasing their dietary intake. Making sure they have recovery days and recovery time. Making sure they're training only what they're supposed to be training and not more. Making sure they have good nutritional support. If they need mental health support, I bring in my mental health guru who saw a lot of my REDS patients, helping to work through either the mindset of the body image issues or some of the psychological sequelae of REDS. And medication-wise, if they've been, so not very often, but sometimes you have to use medication for some of the symptoms of REDS in the short term until, just to get them through until their energy availability will correct it. Occasionally, if I had quite a severe amenorrhea with low bone mineral density and it wasn't improving in 6 to 12 months, more the 6-month range with good intervention, I would perhaps use transdermal estrogen with oral Provera challenge just to bring the bones back up. And that's been shown to work quite effectively. And do that for a year and then try them off and see if we finally got their nutrition up to a point where they can actually start to menstruate and have improvements in their bone density.
That's really interesting. It's just, you turn on one tap, so to speak, you get that nutrition right. And it sort of, spreads into all those other domains like you've touched on, hormonal and psychological and things like that. It's amazing how quickly or how effectively it works.
Yeah, our bodies are a very complex organism, and it's all intertwined. And I think that's really exciting about we've just introduced what we call a physiological model. The very colorful wheel of REDS is great as a concept to understand the idea of what REDS is. But the physiological model is for those, geeks out there that want to understand how things interact. And I'm one of those geeks, by the way. So that physiological model is really, really cool. And there should be one for each different body system that we're working on to bring out. So pretty exciting.
That's amazing. And where do you see the future of the research going for REDS in the next few years? Like, where do you see things heading?
Oh my gosh, there are lots of gaps still within our science. So we're encouraging anyone out there who has a question that they want answered. We would love to have more intervention studies to say what works. So let's have some case controlled or randomized. I don't know how you double blind them, but do some intervention studies so we can see what kind of interventions work on a group basis. They say rugby versus dance or something like that. Like let's do some nice intervention studies would be great. If we're doing, prevalence studies, which we tend to have already quite a few, we would love to see them following a methodology that we can compare data across studies. So one of our papers that we recently published was on gold standards of how to study REDS. And that's a really good guide if anybody's a researcher and looking for advice. That paper led by Ackerman et al., 2023 September BJSM, it really has all kinds of advice and tips on there on how to standardize what you do and how you do it. I'd love to see more field work and less lab work. The lab work was great to set the scene of the science, but nobody lives in a lab. And so what works in the real world with an athlete who's, free living, right? You can't control their intake. You can't control all of their energy expenditure. Some people may have to bike to work or bike to school, and that's an energy expenditure that's over and above their exercise. So more in the free world, that kind of work.
Wow.
And we need more men. It's probably the only topic in all of sport medicine that women have more written about than men. So I am advocating for men to get more research in men with REDS.
I see a few PhDs coming out of Canada there, I think, on this. So if we get more men recruited to these studies, then absolutely that'd be great.
Yeah.
Claire, have you any other questions that you wanted to touch on?
I think we've covered so much. It's been fascinating. Appreciate the time you've taken to speak to us today, Margo. I've learned so much. It's been really illuminating. I think I've covered everything I'd like to ask. I don't think there's anything burning. I'm sure we could talk for hours more. But without going into a real deep dive, I feel we've covered some fantastic. It's
Absolutely.
been brilliant.
I think it's for me, it's been brilliant to talk to someone who's actually not only working in the field, but at the top of the field as well. And I mean that, Margot, it's been an absolute privilege to speak to you tonight. Please wait for incoming emails now in the future from me about questions and queries about how to manage these patients. So once you've made that initial link with me now, sorry, it will be lots of one-way email traffic directed to you. Sorry about that. But I mean, it's absolutely brilliant to have someone who's so qualified in what they do, and it's also how passionate you are about it as well. And I think that really, really brings to the fore there. So, yeah, thank you very, very much indeed for your amazing time and insight tonight. I think we'll have to have you back again to go into more detail.
A pleasure, and thank you for your important role in this, in disseminating the knowledge and awareness. And prevention is key. So thank you.